I was halfway through an old war documentary when my son-in-law stormed into the living room, reached behind my television, ripped the power cable out of the wall, and tossed the remote onto my lap. The screen went black instantly. "Enough of this garbage," Derek Collins snapped. "I'm sick of paying utility bills so a retired old man can sit here wasting electricity all day." For a second, I honestly thought he had lost his mind. Then I remembered something even worse. This wasn't his house. It was mine. I looked up slowly and waited for the words every father expects to hear. "Derek, plug it back in." Instead, my daughter Emily walked into the room carrying grocery bags, glanced at the dark television, then looked at me instead of her husband. "Dad, please don't start another argument." I felt something inside me sink. Derek hadn't embarrassed me nearly as much as Emily had. She hadn't defended me. She hadn't even asked what happened. She had already decided I was the problem before I opened my mouth. Derek smiled, without trying to hide it. "See?" He laughed. "I told you he'd act like a victim." Then he picked up the television cable, held it in front of my face for a moment, and dropped it into the trash can beside the kitchen island. "If you want to watch TV," he said, "buy yourself a place where nobody has to take care of you." Emily lowered her eyes. She never told him to stop. She never told him this house had belonged to her mother and me for almost 30 years. She never reminded him that the only reason they were living there was because I had opened my front door after they said they needed a temporary place to recover from a failed property investment. Instead, she quietly unpacked the groceries as though a man hadn't just thrown my property into the garbage in front of me. "My name is Walter Hayes. I'm 69 years old, and before I retired, I spent 42 years investigating insurance fraud. I made a career out of watching people lie with confident smiles, invent believable stories, and mistake kindness for weakness. Yet somehow, I never imagined I would one day become the easiest target in my own home." I stood up without saying a single word, walked past Derek, opened the trash can, picked up the cable, wiped coffee grounds off the end with a paper towel, and placed it neatly on the kitchen counter. Derek laughed again. "Look at that," he said loudly enough for Emily to hear. "He still thinks he owns the place." Emily finally spoke. "Dad, maybe just stay in your room tonight. Everyone's tired." I stared at my daughter for several long seconds. She didn't sound cruel. She sounded exhausted. Worse still, she sounded like someone who had repeated those words in her head many times before saying them out loud. I nodded once, turned around, and walked upstairs carrying the television cable in my hand. As I reached the hallway, I heard Derek's voice again, quieter this time, because he thought I was already gone. "One more month," he whispered. "Then we won't have to deal with this anymore." Emily answered so softly, I couldn't hear every word, but I caught enough to make my stomach tighten. "Just, don't push him too hard." Derek chuckled. "Relax. He has no idea what's coming." I closed my bedroom door without making a sound and stood there in complete silence. During my career, every major investigation had started with something so small everyone else ignored it. A sentence spoken too confidently, a detail that didn't fit, a smile that lasted half a second too long. Most people reacted to insults. Investigators reacted to patterns. Derek believed tonight was about humiliating an old man in his own living room. He was wrong. The moment he tore that cable from my television, he unknowingly gave a retired fraud investigator his very first piece of evidence. And before I went to sleep that night, I made one pro. I barely slept that night. Not because Derek had insulted me, but because his confidence bothered me far more than his words. Men who lose their temper often make mistakes. Men who smile while humiliating someone usually believe they've already won. At 6 the next morning, I walked downstairs before anyone else was awake. The television cable was still lying exactly where I had left it on the kitchen counter. I plugged it back into the television, pressed the power button, and the screen came to life instantly. There had never been a problem with the electricity or the internet. Derek hadn't unplugged the television because something was broken. He had unplugged it because he wanted me to understand who he believed was in control. Instead of making coffee, I walked through the house, the way I used to walk through fire-damaged buildings during fraud investigations, paying attention to details most people never noticed. The first thing that caught my eye was the mailbox sitting by the front door. For years, every piece of mail addressed to me had been placed on the kitchen table before I woke up. That morning there was nothing, not a single envelope. It wasn't possible. My pension statements always arrived during the first week of the month, and the property tax notice was due any day. I quietly opened the mailbox outside. It was empty. Too empty. Even the advertising flyers were gone. Someone had cleared it completely before I woke up. When Emily came downstairs an hour later, I asked casually, "Did the mail come yesterday?" She hesitated for just a fraction of a second before answering, "I don't think so." That hesitation lasted less than a heartbeat, but after 42 years of interviewing people, I had learned that truth rarely needs time to remember itself. After breakfast, Derek announced he had several client meetings and left with Emily a few minutes later. I waited until their cars disappeared around the corner before beginning something I hadn't done since retiring. I started documenting everything. I took photographs of every room, every drawer that looked recently disturbed, every file cabinet, every locked door, and every document still sitting where I remembered leaving it. Then I walked into the small study that had once belonged to Margaret. Since Emily and Derek moved in, they had converted it into a home office. The door wasn't locked. At first glance, everything looked ordinary. A laptop sat on the desk beside neatly stacked folders. A printer hummed quietly in the corner, and a whiteboard listed upcoming property closings. I wasn't interested in Derek's business. I was interested in patterns. Opening the top desk drawer, I immediately noticed a folder labeled Household Expenses. My name appeared on the first page. I sat down and began reading. Every monthly utility bill, insurance payment, maintenance invoice, and grocery expense had been carefully organized into a spreadsheet. Beside several entries, Derek had written handwritten notes. Walter's medication, Walter's cable, Walter's food. At first I assumed he was simply tracking household costs. Then I noticed another column titled Reimbursement Plan. Every dollar supposedly spent on me had been totaled with surprising precision. My coffee, prescription refills, streaming subscriptions I had never requested. Even routine maintenance on the heating system had been partially assigned to me. I frowned. Derek had been quietly building a financial record designed to make it appear I depended on them far more than I actually did. That alone wasn't illegal, but it raised a question I couldn't ignore. Why would anyone spend months documenting expenses that had never been disputed? Before closing the folder, I photographed every page with my phone and returned everything exactly where I had found it. I was about to leave when a notification appeared on the computer monitor. The screen had been asleep, but an incoming email briefly lit it up before locking again. I only saw the subject line for 2 seconds. Updated capacity evaluation documents. My pulse slowed instead of racing. Excitement has ruined more investigations than impatience ever has. I didn't touch the computer. I simply memorized the sender's name and quietly left the room. By noon, I was sitting in my truck, outside the public library, using my own laptop. The sender turned out to be a law office, specializing in elder care and guardianship matters. I wasn't ready to accuse anyone of anything, but one question now refused to leave my mind. Why would my son-in-law, a real estate broker with no elderly clients living in our house, except me, be receiving documents about mental capacity evaluations? As I closed my laptop, my phone vibrated with a message from Derek. "Hope you're having a relaxing day, Walter. Emily and I might be home late tonight." I read the message twice before putting the phone back into my pocket. It was polite, friendly, even. But after what I had just seen, I no longer read words the way most people did. I read timing. And the timing told me one thing with absolute certainty. Derek wanted to make sure I stayed away from that office for the rest of the day. He had no idea I had already seen enough to know that unplugging my television had never been the real beginning of his plan. It had only been the moment he became careless enough to let me notice it. I didn't return home immediately. Instead, I drove to the county recorder's office, a place I hadn't visited since transferring the deed of my late wife's investment property nearly 12 years earlier. People assume fraud is usually hidden behind locked doors. Most of the time, it isn't. The most dangerous schemes are buried inside public records because almost nobody ever thinks to read them. I asked the clerk for copies of every document connected to my property over the previous 18 months. She handed me a small stack of filings and wished me a pleasant afternoon without realizing she had just placed the first real answers in my hands. Sitting alone at one of the reading tables, I went through each page slowly. There were no forged deeds, no secret transfers. The title was still legally mine. For a brief moment, I wondered if I had allowed my imagination to outrun the facts. Then, I reached a document that wasn't related to ownership at all. It was an application request filed by a law office seeking copies of my property's legal description and tax history on behalf of a future estate planning review. The requesting attorney wasn't someone I had ever hired. More importantly, the request had been submitted by the same firm whose name appeared on the email notification I had seen in Derek's office that morning. That wasn't proof of wrongdoing, but it wasn't a coincidence either. Someone had been gathering information about my assets without ever speaking to me. Back in my truck, I called the county assessor's office under the simple pretense of verifying my tax records. During the conversation, the clerk casually mentioned that someone identifying himself as a family representative had contacted them twice during the past 2 months, asking about exemptions available if an elderly homeowner entered long-term residential care. My grip tightened around the steering wheel. "Did he leave a name?" I asked. She checked her notes. "Yes, Derek Collins." I thanked her, ended the call, and sat in complete silence. Derek hadn't been researching nursing facilities out of curiosity. He had been asking financial questions that only became relevant if I were no longer living in my own house. By the time I returned home that afternoon, my investigation had shifted in a completely different direction. This wasn't about embarrassing an old man until he moved out voluntarily. It was about preparing every administrative step before anyone told me the plan even existed. I unlocked the front door quietly and noticed something I had overlooked for weeks. The hallway cabinet where I always kept my personal documents was slightly open. I knew it because Margaret had spent years reminding me to close it properly. Someone else had searched through it recently. Nothing appeared missing, but the folders weren't arranged in the order I always kept them. Inside, I found my passport, birth certificate, military discharge papers, and property records exactly where they should have been. One item, however, was gone. My original medical power of attorney. I searched every drawer twice before accepting the obvious conclusion. It had disappeared. Less than an hour later, Emily came home carrying takeout for dinner. I watched her carefully as she placed the bags on the kitchen counter. She looked tired, distracted, and unusually nervous. "Everything okay, Dad?" she asked. "Fine," I replied. "I was organizing some paperwork today. Couldn't find one of my old legal files." She froze for the smallest fraction of a second before forcing a smile. "Maybe you misplaced it." There it was again, that tiny pause before speaking. Emily had never been a convincing liar. As a nurse, she comforted frightened patients every day because compassion came naturally to her. Deception never had. Before I could answer, Derek walked in carrying his laptop case. "Good news," he announced cheerfully. "I spoke with someone today about helping you simplify your estate planning. At your age, it's nice to have everything organized before little problems become big ones." I looked directly at him. "I didn't ask anyone to review my estate." He smiled as though I had misunderstood. "Just exploring options." That's what family does. Most people would have challenged him right there. I did something else instead. I smiled back. "I appreciate that." The satisfaction that crossed his face lasted barely a second, but it told me everything I needed to know. Derek believed I was still reacting emotionally instead of thinking strategically. He had underestimated the one habit retirement had never taken away from me. I never confronted a suspect before understanding the entire scheme. That evening, after everyone went to bed, I opened a notebook I hadn't used since leaving the insurance bureau. On the first page, I wrote 3 questions. Why was Derek collecting records about my house? Why had my medical documents disappeared? And why was a guardianship law office communicating with him instead of me? I stared at those questions for several minutes before adding one final sentence beneath them. Tomorrow I stop investigating alone. Tomorrow I call Richard Lawson. Richard Lawson answered my call before the second ring. "Walter," he said cheerfully, "it's been too long." I looked through the windshield for several seconds before replying. "Richard, I need you to pretend I'm not your friend today. I need you to think like an attorney." The warmth disappeared from his voice immediately. "Be in my office at 9. Richard and I had known each other for almost 36 years. While I spent my career investigating fraudulent insurance claims, he built one of the most respected elder law practices in the state. Between us, we'd seen almost every trick dishonest people used against aging parents. What neither of us expected was that one day I'd walk into his office carrying evidence collected inside my own home. I placed everything on his conference table without saying a word. The photographs, the notes, the public records, the missing medical documents, the email subject line I had memorized, the county records, Derek's questions about long-term care. Richard read every page slowly, refusing to let either of us speak until he finished. Nearly 40 minutes passed before he leaned back in his chair and removed his glasses. "Walter," he said quietly, "the good news is your house is still legally yours." I nodded. "And the bad news?" He folded his hands together. "Everything you've shown me points toward preparation, not execution. That's actually more dangerous." I frowned. "Explain." Richard stood and walked toward a whiteboard hanging beside his desk. Across the top, he wrote 3 words: isolation, dependency, incapacity. Then he drew arrows connecting them. Most people think stealing a house requires forging a deed. That's amateur thinking. Professionals don't try to steal property first. They try to gain legal control over the owner. He underlined the final word. Once someone successfully convinces a court that an elderly person can no longer manage their own affairs, everything changes. Bank accounts, medical decisions, property management, financial authority. The house becomes the last step, not the first. I felt my jaw tighten. "You think Derek is building a guardianship case?" Richard looked directly at me. "I think he's collecting the kind of paperwork someone would need if they plan to argue that you're becoming forgetful, financially dependent, and unable to make sound decisions." He picked up one of my photographs showing Derek's handwritten expense spreadsheet. "Look at this, from a judge's perspective. If someone presented months of records claiming they've been paying your bills, managing your medications, buying your groceries, and supervising your daily life, what story would those documents tell?" I answered before he finished. "That I'm already dependent on them." Richard nodded. "Exactly. The paperwork doesn't have to be true. It only has to appear organized enough that nobody asks why it was created." Suddenly, dozens of moments from the previous year made sense. Derek insisting on paying utility bills before asking me to reimburse him, offering to organize my medications, encouraging Emily to attend every doctor's appointment with me, even suggesting that I stop driving because traffic had become stressful. None of those actions seemed suspicious on their own. Together they formed something entirely different. Richard opened another folder and slid several legal forms toward me. "These are guardianship petitions from unrelated cases. Read the language." Every document described the same gradual pattern. Increasing forgetfulness, difficulty managing finances, reliance on family members, resistance to accepting help. It was as if someone had written a script Derek had been quietly rehearsing for months. I closed the file slowly. "So what do we do?" Richard smiled for the first time that morning, but it wasn't a comforting smile. It was the expression of a lawyer who had finally identified his opponent's strategy. "We don't confront him." I couldn't hide my surprise. "Not yet? Not even close." He walked back to the whiteboard and circled the word preparation. "Right now, Derek believes he's writing the story. That's our greatest advantage. If you accuse him today, every document disappears, every email is deleted, every conversation changes overnight. We lose visibility." He handed me a legal pad. "From this moment forward, your job isn't to stop him. Your job is to let him believe his plan is working." The sentence sounded almost impossible. Richard continued before I could object. "You're going to become the most cooperative father-in-law he's ever seen. Agree with him, thank him. Let him think you've stopped asking questions. Meanwhile, I'll secure every document that actually proves you're mentally competent, financially independent, and fully capable of managing your affairs. We'll update your estate plan, record new medical directives, notify your bank, and create a timeline that cannot be challenged later. I looked down at the legal pad in my hands. For the first time since Derek ripped the cable from my television, I no longer felt like an old man reacting to disrespect. I felt like an investigator walking into the opening stage of a carefully planned operation. Richard stood and extended his hand across the table. "Walter," he said, "this case isn't going to be won by proving Derek is a liar. It's going to be won by giving him enough confidence to lie one time too many." I shook his hand, folded the legal pad under my arm, and walked toward the door. As I reached the hallway, Richard called after me one last time. "Tomorrow morning, change absolutely nothing." I turned back. "Nothing?" He nodded once. "Because tomorrow is the day we begin watching who believes you've already lost." The hardest part wasn't gathering evidence. It was pretending nothing had changed. The morning after meeting Richard, I came downstairs wearing the same sweater I always wore, brewed the same coffee, and sat in front of the same dark television Derek had unplugged 2 nights earlier. When he walked into the kitchen, I smiled before he had the chance to speak. "Morning," I said. "I was thinking about what you mentioned the other day. You're right. I probably should let you and Emily handle more of the household responsibilities." He looked at me for a moment, almost surprised by how easily I agreed. Then he smiled. "That's probably for the best." I nodded, as if I had finally accepted my place. Inside, I was measuring every expression on his face. Confidence changes people. It makes them careless. By 9 o'clock, Derek and Emily had left for work, believing I was settling into retirement instead of preparing for war. 10 minutes later, I was driving to First Federal Bank. Sandra Whitmore, the branch manager, had known Margaret and me for nearly 20 years. I closed the office door behind me and placed Richard's authorization letters on her desk. "I need to review every account connected to my name," I said. Sandra spent the next 40 minutes printing statements, updating security credentials, removing every secondary online device linked to my banking profile, and enabling transaction alerts that would notify only my personal phone. Then she stopped typing and looked at the screen with a puzzled expression. "Walter," she said quietly, "did you authorize anyone to request information about adding a trusted financial assistant to your primary accounts?" My heartbeat slowed instead of speeding up. "No." Sandra turned the monitor toward me. 3 weeks earlier, someone had scheduled an appointment to discuss adding emergency financial access in case I became medically incapacitated. The appointment had been canceled before taking place, but the request remained in the system. The contact number listed belonged to Derek. Sandra immediately printed the record and added it to the file Richard had asked me to build. "Nobody accessed your money," she reassured me, "but someone was clearly exploring how to." I thanked her, locked every account behind new security procedures, and left the bank feeling something I hadn't experienced since this ordeal began. Control. My next stop was the county clerk's office, where Richard had already prepared several documents updating my estate records, medical directives, and emergency contacts. Every legal authority connected to my life now pointed back to me alone. If anyone attempted to claim I could no longer manage my own affairs, the most recent records would tell a very different story. By early afternoon, I met Miguel Ortega outside my house. Miguel had replaced locks for several commercial properties I owned years earlier. He didn't ask unnecessary questions. He simply opened his toolbox and said, "Which doors?" I smiled faintly. "All of them." For the next 3 hours, every exterior lock, every garage entry, every side entrance, and every keypad code disappeared one by one. Miguel even replaced the mailbox lock, after I explained that important mail had started disappearing. Before leaving, he handed me 2 complete key sets. "Nobody gets in without these," he said. I slipped one set into my jacket pocket and locked the second, inside the small fireproof safe Margaret had insisted we buy years ago. When the work was finished, I stood alone in the living room, looking around the house. For the first time in months, it felt like mine again. That feeling lasted only until I heard Derek's truck pull into the driveway shortly after 6. Through the front window, I watched him walk confidently toward the porch, carrying a takeout bag in one hand while searching his pocket for his key with the other. He never noticed the new deadbolt until the key refused to turn. He frowned, tried again, then knocked harder than necessary. Emily stood beside him, looking confused. I opened the door only a few inches. Derek forced a laugh. Looks like something's wrong with the lock. Nothing's wrong, I replied calmly. I had every lock in the house replaced today. His smile disappeared. Without telling us? I didn't think I needed permission to secure my own property. For the first time since unplugging my television, Derek looked genuinely unsettled. Walter, we live here. I nodded. You do, because I allowed it. Neither of us spoke for several long seconds. Emily looked back and forth between us, sensing a shift she couldn't yet understand. Derek finally recovered enough to ask, "So, where are our keys?" I looked him directly in the eyes. "We need to have a conversation first." Behind me, the new deadbolt clicked quietly into place as I rested my hand on the inside handle. On the other side of that door stood the man who believed he had spent months taking control of my life. He still hadn't realized that, for the first time since this began, he was the one asking permission to come inside. Derek didn't argue immediately. That surprised me. Instead, he stepped back from the porch, slipped his phone out of his pocket, and looked at me with the same calm expression I'd seen the day he unplugged my television. "Walter," he said, "I think you're making a mistake you'll regret." I answered just as calmly. "I've made plenty of mistakes in my life. This isn't one of them." He nodded once and dialed a number without taking his eyes off me. Less than 15 minutes later, 2 patrol cars stopped in front of the house. Emily looked terrified. Derek, on the other hand, looked relieved. He wasn't trying to intimidate me. He believed the law would force me to let them back inside. As the officers walked toward the porch, Derek spoke first. "Officers, I'm glad you're here. My father-in-law is confused. He changed every lock in the house while we were at work. Our clothes, medications, and personal belongings are all inside, and I think he's having one of those episodes older people sometimes have. It was a well-prepared story. He never accused me of being violent. He never raised his voice. He simply planted one dangerous idea, that I was no longer capable of making rational decisions." Officer Noah Grant looked toward me. "Sir, is this your residence?" "Yes," I answered. "It's my home. I purchased it 28 years ago, and the deed is solely in my name." Derek immediately interrupted. "He's forgetting that we've been taking care of him for months. He's becoming increasingly confused." I reached into my jacket slowly so the officers could see every movement and handed them my driver's license, property tax statement, and a certified copy of the deed Richard had prepared earlier that afternoon. Noah reviewed the documents before passing them to his supervising officer, Lieutenant Ethan Brooks, who had just arrived. Ethan studied the paperwork carefully, then looked at Derek. "Do you own any part of this property?" Derek hesitated for the first time. "No, but we're immediate family." Ethan nodded. "Family and ownership aren't the same thing." Derek recovered quickly. He's not thinking clearly. "We've been handling his finances, his medications, almost everything." I expected that sentence. In fact, Richard had predicted it almost word for word. Without saying anything, I handed Ethan another folder. Inside were copies of my updated estate documents, this week's banking confirmations, my physician's annual cognitive assessment completed only 3 months earlier, and notarized records, proving I had personally completed every legal update within the last 48 hours. Ethan read the physician's report twice before looking back at me. "Your doctor states you're fully competent to manage your own financial and personal affairs." "That's correct," I replied. Derek immediately changed direction. "Those papers don't show what's been happening at home." Ethan turned toward him. "Then what exactly has been happening?" Derek pointed toward me. "He's becoming paranoid. He thinks people are trying to steal from him." For several seconds, nobody spoke. Then I quietly placed one final document into Ethan's hands. It was the incident report Sandra Whitmore had prepared, showing an attempt to obtain information about adding emergency financial authority to my accounts. Beneath it sat copies of the county records, documenting inquiries about long-term care tax exemptions connected to my property. Ethan's expression changed almost instantly. He looked at Derek again, this time with far greater interest than before. Mr. Collins, he asked, can you explain why you contacted the bank regarding emergency financial access to accounts that aren't yours? Derek opened his mouth, then stopped. Before he could recover, Ethan continued. And why you contacted the county asking about tax implications if the homeowner entered long-term residential care. Emily slowly turned toward her husband. Derek, she whispered. He didn't answer her. His eyes remained fixed on Ethan. Those were only questions, he finally said. Planning ahead isn't illegal. No? Ethan agreed. It isn't. He paused before continuing. Neither is a homeowner changing the locks on his own house. The silence that followed lasted only a few seconds, but it completely changed the balance of the conversation. Derek was no longer speaking to officers who assumed he was protecting an elderly relative. He was speaking to investigators who had begun asking him questions instead. Ethan closed the folder and handed every document back to me. Mr. Hayes, based on everything we've reviewed, you're within your legal rights to control access to your property. Then he turned toward Derek and Emily. If you need personal belongings, that can be arranged peacefully at a mutually agreed time. But you cannot force entry into someone else's home. Derek's jaw tightened, but he said nothing. He understood arguing would only make things worse. Emily looked at me with tears forming in her eyes, but I couldn't tell whether they came from sadness or confusion. Before leaving, Ethan asked if I wanted an incident report documenting the encounter. Yes, I answered. Please, he nodded. I would recommend keeping detailed records from this point forward. I almost smiled. If only he knew how many records already existed. The patrol cars disappeared down the street a few minutes later. Derek stood motionless beside his truck, staring at the front door without saying a word. Then, for the first time since this all began, I saw something I had never seen in his eyes before. It wasn't fear. Derek Collins wasn't afraid yet. It was frustration. His carefully constructed plan had just collided with something he hadn't anticipated. A man who understood investigations, as well as he understood manipulation. As he finally climbed into his truck, he looked directly at me through the windshield. He didn't wave. He didn't speak. He simply held my gaze for several long seconds before driving away. After 42 years investigating fraud, I recognized that look immediately. It was the expression people wore when their first plan failed. And they had just started thinking about a far more dangerous second one. 3 days passed without a single phone call from Derek. That silence worried me more than any argument could have. Men like Derek rarely accepted defeat quietly. They disappeared only long enough to prepare a different strategy. Richard called every evening to check on me, and each time he repeated the same advice. Don't mistake silence for surrender. By Friday night, I understood exactly what he meant. At 11:17 p.m., motion alerts from the security cameras I had installed years earlier lit up my phone. I opened the live feed and immediately saw Derek walking slowly across the front yard wearing a dark hooded jacket. He wasn't trying to hide his identity. He was making sure no one else could clearly see his face from the street. Instead of calling the police immediately, I opened the recording function on my phone and watched. Derek stopped beside my mailbox, looked around, then sprayed black paint across the front until my house number disappeared beneath thick streaks of graffiti. A second later, he kicked the mailbox hard enough to bend the metal post before walking toward the porch. He never touched the front door. He knew better than to force entry after the officers had already warned him. Instead, he picked up a landscaping brick from the flower bed and threw it through the passenger side window of my pickup truck parked in the driveway. The sound of shattering glass echoed through the neighborhood. Only then did I dial 911. I never stepped outside. I never shouted his name. I simply continued recording while the dispatcher stayed on the line. Derek walked away less than a minute before the patrol cars arrived. Officer Noah Grant was the first to recognize me. "Mr. Hayes," he said. "Are you hurt?" I shook my head and handed him my phone. Everything's recorded. Noah watched the footage twice before forwarding it directly to Lieutenant Ethan Brooks. The officers photographed the damage, collected paint samples, and recovered fragments of the brick lying inside my truck. Before leaving, Ethan looked at me and said, "He's becoming emotional. That's usually when people start making mistakes." I appreciated his confidence, but I had investigated enough fraud cases to know something else. Emotional people make careless mistakes. Manipulative people become more dangerous after their first failure. The next afternoon, Emily arrived alone. She stood at the front gate instead of walking to the porch. The distance between us felt much greater than the few yards separating us. "Can we talk?" she asked quietly. I opened the gate without saying a word. She looked exhausted. Dark circles framed her eyes, and she kept twisting her wedding ring while searching for the right words. "Derek says someone is trying to destroy his reputation," she began. I didn't interrupt. "He says you've been working with lawyers to make him look like a criminal." I nodded slowly. "And what do you think?" She looked down at the broken glass still scattered beside my truck. "I don't know what to think anymore." That answer told me more than anything else she could have said. A month earlier, Emily would have defended her husband without hesitation. Now uncertainty had replaced certainty. I invited her inside and made coffee exactly the way Margaret used to make it. For nearly an hour, we talked about everything except Derek. We spoke about her work at the hospital, about her mother's old rose garden, about the house she grew up in. It wasn't until she stood to leave that she finally asked the question she'd been avoiding. "Dad, if Derek really did all this, why didn't you tell me sooner?" I looked at her for a long moment before answering. Because people trapped by manipulation rarely believe evidence presented too early. They have to notice the cracks themselves. Emily didn't respond. She simply hugged me for the first time in months before walking back to her car. I watched her drive away with a feeling I hadn't experienced since this nightmare began. Hope. It was small, fragile, and uncertain, but it was there. That evening, however, hope collided with reality. Just after 9 o'clock, my phone rang. It was Sandra Whitmore from the bank. "Walter," she said calmly, "someone tried again today to obtain information about your accounts. This time they claimed it was an emergency involving your health." I closed my eyes. Did they succeed? No. The new security procedures worked exactly as intended. I thanked her and ended the call. Less than 5 minutes later, another notification appeared on my phone. This one came from Richard. It contained only 7 words. "Check your email. Don't reply to anyone." I opened my inbox and immediately found a message from a law firm I had never contacted. The subject line read, "Notice of intent to petition for emergency guardianship evaluation." Derek hadn't given up. He had simply decided to stop waiting. And for the first time since I began this investigation, I realized we were no longer preparing for the possibility of a legal battle. It had already begun. 3 days after the emergency guardianship notice arrived, Richard called with the update I had been expecting but still hoped would never come. Derek's attorney had withdrawn the petition before it reached a judge. On paper, it looked like a retreat. Richard disagreed. "He's changing tactics," he warned. "People who build control through paperwork often become unpredictable once paperwork stops working." I understood exactly what he meant. Derek had spent months trying to remove me from my own life without raising his voice. That plan had failed. The question was what he would do when manipulation no longer produced the results he wanted. I found the answer sooner than I expected. Late Saturday afternoon, Emily called. Her voice sounded unusually cheerful. She said Derek wanted to apologize for everything and hoped we could all meet for dinner the following week. I listened without interrupting. The invitation wasn't for my benefit. It was for hers. Derek knew he was losing her confidence, and experienced manipulators rarely attack a relationship directly when they feel it slipping away. They become charming instead. "Take your time," I told her. "You don't owe me an answer tonight." She hesitated before quietly saying, "Dad, I don't think I know him anymore." Those words stayed with me long after the call ended. They weren't an accusation. They were the first honest sentence Emily had spoken about her marriage since this nightmare began. 2 nights later, just after 11, my phone rang again. This time there was no greeting, only breathing. Heavy, uneven breathing. "Emily?" I asked. For several seconds she couldn't answer. Then I heard something crash in the background, followed by Derek shouting so loudly that I couldn't understand every word. What I did understand was enough. "You talked to him," he yelled. "You're choosing him over me." Emily finally found her voice. "Dad," she whispered, "don't hang up." I was already grabbing my keys. "Where are you?" Another crash echoed through the phone. Glass shattered. A door slammed. Emily's breathing became faster. "He's trying to get into the bathroom." Every instinct I had developed over 42 years told me to stay calm. Panic, clouds, judgment, and judgment was the only thing Emily needed from me. "Listen carefully," I said while starting the truck. "Lock the door, stay away from the window, keep talking to me." She tried to answer, but another violent bang interrupted her. Derek was kicking the bathroom door. "Open this door," he screamed. "We're finishing this conversation now." I called 911 from the truck's hands-free system without ending the call with Emily. The dispatcher listened as I explained exactly what I was hearing in real time. She confirmed officers were already being sent. The drive felt longer than any journey I had ever taken. Every red light seemed designed to test my patience. Every second reminded me that my daughter was facing something no parent should ever have to imagine. When I turned onto their street, flashing blue lights were already reflecting off the neighboring houses. I stopped the truck before reaching the driveway and ran toward the front door, just as two officers forced their way inside. Derek was standing in the hallway holding part of the broken bathroom doorknob in his hand. He froze when he saw the uniforms. The bathroom door hung half open, splintered around the lock. Emily was sitting on the floor inside, shaking uncontrollably, her phone still clutched in one hand. She looked at me, and for the first time since she was a little girl, I saw absolute fear in her eyes. Not fear of losing an argument, fear of the man she had married. She didn't speak. She simply stood up and walked straight past the officers until she reached me. Then she wrapped both arms around me and started crying so hard she couldn't breathe. "I'm sorry," she kept repeating. "Dad, I'm so sorry." I held her without saying a word. Some apologies don't need an answer. They need safety. Behind us, Derek tried to explain everything away. He claimed they had only been arguing. He insisted Emily had overreacted. He even suggested she was emotionally exhausted because of the stress I had caused between them. Lieutenant Ethan Brooks arrived only minutes later and listened to every version without interruption. Then he asked a single question. "Does anyone have the recording of the emergency call?" The dispatcher had preserved everything. Emily's whispered pleas, Derek kicking the door, his threats, my instructions from the truck. There was no debate left. No conflicting memories. No room for clever explanations. Ethan looked at Derek for several long seconds before calmly informing him he was under arrest on suspicion of domestic violence, criminal property damage, and intimidation. Derek didn't resist. He looked at Emily instead. "Tell them," he said quietly. "Tell them I would never hurt you." Emily slowly wiped the tears from her face. For almost a full minute, she said nothing. Then she looked directly at the man she had defended for months and quietly answered, "I already did. They heard everything." Those 6 words ended their marriage long before any court ever would. As Officer Noah Grant led Derek toward the patrol car, he turned once and stared at me with the same cold confidence he had worn the day he ripped the cable from my television. Only this time, there was something new behind his eyes. He finally understood that he hadn't lost because I was smarter than he was. He had lost because the moment he stopped pretending, the only witness he had never planned for his own wife had been standing close enough to hear the truth. Emily leaned against my shoulder as the patrol car pulled away, but before either of us could speak, Lieutenant Brooks walked back toward us holding a sealed evidence bag. "Mr. Hayes," he said quietly, "while securing the house, my officers found something in Derek's office that I think your attorney needs to see immediately." I took the evidence bag from Lieutenant Ethan Brooks without opening it. After everything that had happened over the previous 2 months, I had learned one lesson better than any investigator ever could. Evidence loses its value the moment curiosity gets in the way of procedure. Richard met us at his office before sunrise the next morning. Emily sat beside me without saying a word, while Ethan placed the sealed bag on the conference table. Inside was a black leather binder, 2 encrypted flash drives, and a notebook written almost entirely in Derek's handwriting. Richard carefully photographed everything before breaking the evidence seal. The notebook was the first thing he examined. Halfway through the first page, he quietly removed his glasses and looked at me. Walter, he documented everything. Derek hadn't kept a diary. He had built a playbook. Every conversation with me had been summarized. Every financial move had been dated. Every interaction with Emily included handwritten notes evaluating whether she was fully supportive, emotionally uncertain, or requires reassurance. Beside one entry describing the night, he unplugged my television. He had written a single sentence that made the room fall completely silent. Humiliation produces faster compliance than confrontation. Emily covered her mouth with both hands. She stared at the page for several seconds before whispering, "He was studying us." Richard continued reading. Another section contained detailed timelines explaining how to establish the appearance of dependency. Encourage Walter to let Derek pay household expenses, handle prescription refills, organize financial paperwork, accompany him to medical appointments whenever possible, suggest he stop driving, build records before filing guardianship. None of it had been spontaneous. Every gesture Derek presented as kindness had been part of a long-term strategy. Then Richard inserted the first flash drive into his laptop. A folder appeared containing scanned copies of emails, draft legal documents, spreadsheets, and property projections. Derek had estimated the market value of my home, calculated potential profit after renovation, and even prepared a 5-year financial forecast, assuming the property would eventually be sold. My name appeared repeatedly beside one phrase that returned again and again. Transition complete. Emily turned away from the screen before the next document appeared. She was no longer crying. She looked empty, as though every memory of the last 3 years had suddenly become something she no longer recognized. The second flash drive proved even more damaging. It contained recorded phone conversations between Derek and 2 outside consultants discussing guardianship procedures, methods of documenting cognitive decline, and strategies for minimizing resistance from elderly homeowners. None of the recordings directly instructed anyone to commit a crime, but together they demonstrated intent more clearly than any confession ever could. Richard closed the laptop and immediately contacted the prosecutor assigned to Derek's case. By midday, investigators had obtained search warrants covering Derek's business records, electronic devices, and office files. Carter Real Estate Solutions suspended his broker's license pending review, and the state licensing board opened a separate investigation into whether he had abused professional knowledge for personal financial gain. 2 weeks later, 3 additional families contacted the prosecutor after recognizing striking similarities between Derek's methods and situations they had experienced with elderly relatives. What had begun as one family's private nightmare quickly expanded into a much broader investigation involving financial exploitation of vulnerable homeowners. Derek's attorney attempted to negotiate. He argued that no property had actually been transferred and that my financial losses had been prevented before they occurred. The prosecutor answered with a sentence I will never forget. The law doesn't require a victim to lose everything before intent becomes criminal. Watching that hearing, I felt no satisfaction. I had spent decades putting dishonest people in prison, and the outcome never brought the sense of victory outsiders imagined. Courtrooms don't repair families. They only determine responsibility. Emily filed for divorce less than a month after Derek's arrest. She refused every attempt he made to contact her, even after he began claiming he had only been trying to protect their future. One afternoon, she came to my house carrying a cardboard box filled with photographs from their wedding. Without saying a word, she placed the box beside the fireplace. "I don't want to destroy them," she said quietly, "but I can't keep pretending those memories were real." Together, we stored the box in the attic. Neither of us opened it again. Several months later, Richard called with the final update. Derek accepted a plea agreement that included charges related to attempted financial exploitation of an elderly person, evidence tampering connected to the missing legal documents, and domestic violence arising from the night of Emily's emergency call. His real estate license was permanently revoked. Civil proceedings regarding financial damages continued separately, but by then none of that mattered to me. The day I walked out of the courthouse after the sentencing hearing, reporters waited outside hoping for a statement. One asked whether I finally felt I had won. I stopped walking, looked at the cameras for a moment, and answered as honestly as I could. If your daughter loses the man she believed she married, nobody wins. Then I got into my truck and drove home. That evening, Emily stood beside me on the back porch, watching the sun disappear behind the trees Margaret had planted years earlier. After several quiet minutes, she finally asked the question she'd been carrying since the night Derek was arrested. Dad, after everything he did, how did you keep yourself from hating him? I looked out across the yard before answering. Because hatred would have made him the last person deciding how the rest of my life would be lived. Emily nodded slowly. She didn't say another word. Neither of us noticed the old television inside the living room quietly beginning the evening news on its own timer. Months earlier, Derek had unplugged it, believing he was taking away an old man's comfort. He never realized he had also awakened the instincts that ultimately exposed everything he had spent years trying to hide. And as I watched the lights come on inside the house, I understood that the final chapter of this story would never be about the man who tried to steal my home. It would be about how we chose to rebuild one. 6 months passed before this house truly felt like home again. The silence was still there, but it no longer sounded lonely. It sounded peaceful. Emily moved into a small apartment closer to the hospital where she worked, insisting she needed to rebuild her life, one honest day at a time. Every Sunday afternoon she came over for lunch, and little by little our conversations stopped revolving around court hearings, lawyers, or Derek. We talked about patients who had made her laugh, flowers that refused to bloom the way Margaret used to expect, and baseball games neither of us really cared about but watched anyway, because they reminded us of simpler years. Healing, I discovered, doesn't arrive with dramatic speeches. It slips quietly back into ordinary moments you once believed were gone forever. Richard officially closed my legal file the following month. Before leaving my house that afternoon, he handed me the thick binder that had documented every step of the investigation. "You won't need this anymore," he said. I thanked him, carried it to the fireplace, and placed it on the shelf beside Margaret's old photo albums. Not because I wanted to remember the battle, but because I wanted to remember the lesson. Evidence protects the truth, but wisdom prevents you from needing evidence in the first place. A few weeks later, Sandra Whitmore called to tell me that all temporary security measures on my accounts could finally be removed. I thanked her for everything she had done and asked her to leave every safeguard exactly where it was. She laughed softly and said, "I had a feeling you'd say that. Retirement had taught me something my career never could. Trust and verification are not enemies. They belong together. The people who deserve your trust will never be offended because you protect yourself." One Saturday morning, Emily helped me clean the attic. Near the back wall, we found the old cardboard box containing wedding photographs she had packed away after the divorce. She opened it, looked at the first picture for a few seconds, then quietly closed the lid again. "I'm not angry anymore," she said. "I'm just sad that I ignored so many things because I wanted to believe the best about someone." I rested my hand gently on hers. "Believing the best about people isn't a weakness," I told her. "Refusing to see the truth after it appears is." She nodded thoughtfully, and for the first time since everything had happened, I saw the same quiet strength in her eyes that Margaret used to carry. Life moved forward. The broken truck window was replaced. The damaged mailbox disappeared. Fresh flowers grew where shattered glass had once covered the driveway. Neighbors stopped asking careful questions whenever they saw me outside, because there was no longer a story to whisper about. There was simply an old man taking care of his home again. Sometimes people ask whether I regret letting Emily and Derek move in with me. My answer always surprises them. No, I don't. If I could go back, I would still open my front door for my daughter. I would still choose generosity. What I would change is believing that love alone is enough to protect a family. Love needs boundaries. Kindness needs wisdom. And trust should never require surrendering common sense. There is one thing I never replaced after everything was over. The television cable Derek ripped from the wall that evening. It still works perfectly, but I coiled it neatly and placed it inside the drawer of the cabinet beneath the television. Every time I open that drawer, I remember the night a man thought he was taking away something as small as an evening program. He never realized he was giving a retired investigator the first clue that saved not only a house, but a family. That cable reminds me that life rarely changes because of one enormous event. More often, it changes because we finally decide not to ignore one small moment that doesn't feel right. If this story has taught me anything, it's this. Never confuse silence with weakness. Never mistake manipulation for love. And never allow guilt to convince you that protecting yourself is selfish. Sometimes the bravest thing a parent can do isn't opening the door for their child. Sometimes it's knowing when that door must remain closed until the child decides to change. Thank you for spending this journey with me. If Walter's story meant something to you, let me know in the comments where you're watching from and what you would have done if you had been sitting on that sofa the night the television suddenly went black. And if you enjoy stories about family, justice, and the quiet courage it takes to stand up for yourself, don't forget to subscribe. Until next time, take care of the people you love, but never stop protecting the life you've worked so hard to build.